Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Victor Davis Hanson, for joining me. I'm looking very much to this discussion.
I hope so too.
I wanted to start by bringing up someone who probably not quoted very often in the Tikva Fund, and that is the socialist data scientist David Shor, who has kind of made a name for himself in interviews following the 2020 election. And I was just rereading one of his most recent interviews, and it sounded for a moment as though Victor Davis Hanson were speaking. He was asked by Eric Levitz of New York Magazine how the Republican Party would have fared in 2016 had they not nominated Donald Trump. And here's what Eric Levitz, a socialist, said. If she, meaning Hillary, had maintained Obama's coalition, if her 49.6% of the vote had the same ratio of college to non-college educated voters as Obama had in 2012, she would have won that election. And then he went on to say this. Donald Trump, says David Shor, is unpopular, and he does pay a penalty for that relative to a generic Republican. But the voters he's popular with happen to be extremely efficiently distributed in political geography. So for David Shor, Donald Trump was an asset to the Republican Party between 2016 and 2020.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I kind of wrote that in the case for Trump, which is an analysis why he won. I don't think the Republican establishment calibrated just how deep the antipathy was for John McCain and Mitt Romney. Some of it warranted, some of it not. But people, when I would talk to them, and I live out here where there's the remnants of the Oklahoma diaspora of the 1930s. So it's poor whites. They're shrinking in numbers. But when you mentioned a Republican, they associated it with country clubs, golfing, that kind of Mitt Romney type of, as one person said, any guy that wears a wingtips with jeans, I'm not going to vote for. But Trump was able, and the elites thought no Manhattan billionaire can be a populist. But as I said in an earlier minute, when he came out here to raise money, and that's the only reason he came to California, I talked to a lot of people who went to see him. They were all farmers, agribusiness, but not all agribusiness, farm workers, the whole ag community. And so I said, did he have the straw in the mouth, the caterpillar cat, the work boots? That's what they all do when they come out here. And they said, no, he came out here with his red tie down to his genitals, and he had a suit on, and he had the orange day, and he had this awful Queen's accent, and he was just perfectly authentic. So I think that's what resonated with a lot of people. But I think that was the problem, by the way, Matt, with the two schools of never Trumpism. One school has gone all the way over and is really in the Biden camp. And so they saw Trump as a catharsis or a window into who they really were or what the real politics really were. And that gave them an opportunity to redefine their entire political trajectory. And then the others, they felt that once Trump was out of the equation, then they could concentrate on conservative issues again. And they had been distracted, or they thought he was polluting them. But the problem with both is I don't think they ever really gave us a methodology of how his personality differed from other presidents. Did he do things that were more unconstitutional than Barack Obama? Or did he conduct himself while in the White House in a fashion that was more reckless than JFK or LBJ or Bill Clinton? And I could never see that argument that was convincing. I did see the argument that his gratuitous tweeting turned off a key constituency of 3 to 4%. And that came back to haunt him, I think, in the 2020 election.
I want to ask you about how Trump changed the Republican Party and what that might mean for the years ahead, and as well as the conservative movement. You wrote last October, Victor, what elected Trump in 2016 was a recalibration of American foreign and domestic policy and the act of politicking itself. So kind of three recalibrations: foreign policy, domestic policy, and then politics. Yes. Could you expand on that? How did he change those three things? And do you think his effect will persist even with him out of office?
I'm not sure about answer the last question first. I'm not sure about the personality, although it may well. But on the other two issues, I think it's with us. And the one thing to say in the first is that for all the hype about the MAGA agenda, the reason why Romney Republicans, 91% in 2016, and maybe the polls are right, that 95% for all the Lincoln Project efforts, the Republican loyalty to their nominee went up. And that was because that 80% of his agenda was traditional Republicanism. Take his controversial persona out of the equation, and whether it was deregulation or energy development or opposition to abortion or tax cuts, he pretty much did what all Republicans say they're going to do. But what was different were those 4 or 5 issues, and they broke down domestically, as you said, in foreign policy. Foreign policy was to redefine free trade as fair trade, whether that he was effective in achieving that. Nevertheless, he said that people on the two coasts have crafted a commercial policy for the United States is not put the workers first. In other words, outsourcing, offshoring, Xeroxing labor abroad. That was new. And I'm speaking to somebody at the Hoover Institution where you have 5 or 6 brilliant free market economists who are gospel adherents to creative destruction. But he really ran against creative destruction, that idea that just things are always laying people out of work as we try to get the ultimate efficiency in production. And then as well as that, of course, China, he said that China was never, the more money and the more exemptions and the more tolerance for their commercial banditry, they're not going to become Manhattan or Cambridge, Massachusetts. They have a trajectory that's been on world domination. That was new. In the Middle East, he completely rejected the Obama, we're going to tilt toward the Persian Shia, and with that, Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria, the Assads, as if they were somewhat left out of the previous equations. And he basically said, Israel is a free market, consensual government. They have values that we like, and they're going to attract in their orbit without our help. They already have a lot of moderate Arab worlds, and that's the making of a coalition that supports our interest, and especially since we don't need to go in there for energy development or access. We don't need optional wars anymore to ensure our own oil and gas. So on those foreign policy issues, that was very different. And then everybody had said that NATO should contribute their 2% goal of GDP on defense, but nobody really wanted to bell that cat. So they were like little mice saying, oh, it's so terrible they don't contribute, but nobody really wanted to confront them. Trump not only confronted them, he wanted to confront them, especially Germany. And that had trade issues behind it as well. On domestic, I think the big thing is the border. He said that he revived a lot of economists, kind of a minority of economist arguments that an open border with, as the Yale study said, 19 million illegal immigrants meant a erosion in wages over the last 20 years. And so that was one of the arguments he used, a secure border, a wall, and not to be ashamed of that. It wasn't nativism or protectionism or racism. It was just self-interest. And then finally, as far as his style was strange because it was based on 2 principles. One was, we're not going to lose nobly anymore, like Mitt Romney did, and John McCain. We're going to win ugly. And that was a throwback to, I guess, Lee Atwater. Last time I'd seen that in a Republican, maybe you can remember, although you were much younger than I am, was when Lee Atwater ran the Willie Horton, the Boston Harbor, the tank ad. And when he got done, that 17-point lead of Mike Dukakis was shattered. Well, later, when he had a brain tumor in extremis, he apologized for his negative campaigning. But Republicans had played by the Marquis of Queensberry rules, and the Clintons didn't. And Trump said, I'm not either. So that was new. And that also appealed to the working class, because that's the world that the working class people live in. There's not a lot of niceties and subterfuge, and that played into the idea that he was authentic. And then finally, I think these issues, he's basically told people that the left is not the left that we all knew, and which he was at one time, a Democrat or a classical liberal or even a moderate progressive. It's been hijacked by a hard left, and they mean to destroy the traditions and customs of America. And he basically said, I'm the only thing between you and them. You may not like me, but chemotherapy does address cancer, and it makes you sick in the process, but get rid of chemotherapy and you've got a metastasis. And that's pretty much where we are. So I think the domestic and foreign will stay with us, that tweaking of the traditional agenda. And then whether a Republican will act and talk like Trump, I doubt it, but I think they're going to be more confrontational.
Would you say that conservatism is united today? I mean, you mentioned earlier the Never Trumpers. You mentioned the Lincoln Project. It seems as though those efforts have been somewhat self-marginalizing in terms of their relationship with the conservative movement. Is that your assessment, or?
That's absolutely true, and you can see the reaction to it just without getting into any hyper partisanship. So you have on the one hand the Bulwark, on the other hand National Review, both adamant Never Trump magazines. And after the election is over, the Bulwark is sort of troubled whether they want to go the full Joe Biden left wing, and then they still want to dwell on Trump. And then you have National Review, and I'm speaking to somebody who doesn't write for National Review. I think they pick up my syndicated column, but I don't write anymore for them. And their attitude is, let's just stop now the Trump obsession, and he's got done with, and let's go back and start critiquing Joe Biden. So almost every article in National Review is his abortion policy is wrong. He's going after religious freedom. He's going after free speech. He's going after free market economics. So they've spun back to pre-Trump National Review. And I think it's been a lasting change for people associated with the Bulwark.
A lot of your writing deals with the kind of the rural-urban divide. I mean, it's something that you've kind of lived in your life, and also something that you've studied with in ancient Greece and carried up to today. How dangerous has that divide become in American life in the early 21st century? And is there any way that you've seen in your studies to bridge the divide, or is it really kind of one set of values eventually triumphs over another?
Well, we should start with the idea that the reason that we have two weird things in our constitutional republic, like two senators from Wyoming with 250,000 voters each, and two senators from California with 20 million voters each, or the electoral college, and this checks and balances, was because the founders did not want an Athenian democracy. They had read about it. They'd read about the expedition to Sicily, Corcyra, Milos, etc., Mytilene, and they wrote about it. And they wanted a constitutional republic. And why was that? Because they felt, as Jefferson, and he was the most extreme proponent, that there was something about rural life that would be a constant check on urban excess, that when you put people inside cities and they were not familiar with being necessarily autonomous, independent, archaic, as the Greeks would call it, and they were not familiar with nature, they lost a sense of realism. Whereas people in the country that had to produce their own water, food, sewage, everything, in their way of world, they looked at the world as constantly dangerous. Almost every day you get up on a farm, like I got up this morning at 4:30, I thought, well, a pump has been going off. And my wife said to me, hey, check that toilet. I thought, oh, wow, is the septic system working? And then there's guys producing on. So it's just a different set of than me going up to the Hoover Institution and being a tenured senior fellow that you have job security, the check comes in the mail. I never say to myself, oh, did this almond huller cheat on the almonds, or when is the check coming? It's a different, predictable, safe lifestyle, which is good. It allows us to write and think and create things once you take away those worries, but it also creates a complacency. And when you get so many people in so many cities, and you do it geographically, like we'll see the difference on the two coasts, the coastal culture, and everybody in between. And so I have friends at Hoover have literally never been to Bakersfield or Fresno. If you ask them to give me a map of Shanghai or London or Paris, they could. They can talk about restaurants in Paris. They can tell you everything you want to know about Seoul or Tokyo. You ask them where's the downtown in Bakersfield, they have no clue. So that's the difference, that these two coastal societies feel more akin with people across the oceans than they do within that. And I will say, just in finishing, I don't think the animus is mutual. So when I talk about people, they'll just say, oh, that's a talking head. They're not malicious. But when I go back and forth, what I hear from people in Palo Alto about the deplorables or the dregs or the Neanderthals, the chump, any of those terms, it's pretty angry. I was in Whole Foods right before the lockdown, and I showed my license because I didn't have my credit card, and I wrote a check, and she said, Fresno, does the people really live there? And I said, Palo Alto, how can you live in this place? Like homeless people. I said, you know, two rich people at Google walking over the corpses almost of people sleeping on El Camino Real, this la la land of people with Mercedes and Lexus, 19 years old, going into Stanford universities in flip-flops with BLM stickers on their Lexus. You know, this is a joke. And she just looked at me. How dare you say that? That's heresy. So I do think that the animus usually come, and you could see it in this 2016 when Hillary started in the deplorables, and then Joe Biden continued that with his chumps, dregs, and then a Neanderthal. The choice of words is revealing. You know,
where does kind of the suburban middle class kind of fit into this schema of?
They're funny, aren't they? Because when you drive through suburban America, you can see a Ford Laredo pickup with all-weather tires on it, four-wheel drive, and then SUVs. And so there's a romance among the suburbanites of getting out there and being on the outdoors and being independent. And I think in some ways, for many of them that are small business people, autonomous, they feel, and I think they're right about that, because we're only talking about 1% of the population is actually farming, and the rural life itself is about 25% pure rural life, small town. So the suburbanite is the key, and I don't know whether they're going to be urban, sophisticated, horizontal living, or the suburban lifestyle is the natural modern evolution of country life, but they're a different bunch. They have elements of both the taste of the urbanite and yet the recoil at central control. And I think you could really see it during the COVID this past year, where they really came down on the side. I think most of them did. I want my kids back in school, right, and I don't like these riots, and I want safety and security, rather than what we saw with the Antifa, BLM, and their supporting cast in the big cities.
A little bit more on this question. You've written before that really the realignment of the two parties or of politics is really not on basis of race or ethnicity or the kind of identity obsessions of the urban coasts, but really about class. And tell us a little bit more about that. And is that a trend, do you think, that might persist into the near future?
Yeah, I think that is a revolutionary trend. And I think that was one of the reasons that people hated Donald Trump, because even after all of the elite media said he was a racist and all of these stories about how insensitive that he was, he probably got around 35% of the Hispanic vote, as good or better than any other Republican. And he probably, I think black males, he went up something like 18%, where he went from 8 to 12% with black people. And that, because of the Democratic fragility, they're not picking up the white vote as much as they thought they could retain, especially the blue collar white vote. You don't have to have a high figure. That's sort of a gospel among demographers. If you got maybe 40% of the Hispanic vote and 28% of the black vote, I think the Democratic Party, as we know, would be all through. And so what he argued was, I talk like you, I act like you, and I'm interested in jobs, and nationalism, patriotism. Anybody within our borders, I'm for, and anybody that's not, that's their problem. And that appealed to a lot of people who from different races. And so I have a lot of friends here in Selma, which is about 90% Hispanic, about 30% illegal aliens. Across the road right here, there's somebody from Mexico, and there's probably 40 people living there in trailers and all sorts of. But when you talk to these people being immigrants or first generation, they don't have an antipathy, a hatred for Trump. And you think they would based on what the elite media says. Sometimes it's kind of the Cadillo effect where they like a strong leader. But most of it is just, he's for jobs, and gasoline prices went down, and he's right, we pay too much for PG&E and electricity. So those populist issues, if you had a charismatic leader that would focus on them, they could be ecumenical in the sense that they would. That's, I think, the only way out of this racial divide that we see. When we turn on the TV and there's a $3 billion Oprah in a $90 million estate in Montecito, and she's talking to the royals, who are probably worth $50 million, and from their $15 million house, and they're talking about a rumor of racism. We're all the way back to Oprah, I think 5 years ago, was claiming she wanted a $40,000 crocodile purse in a Swiss boutique, and the Swiss boutique minimum wage earner was rude to her. Said, "Oh, that's for," because she didn't know who Oprah was. So the whole racial polarization has become absurd. And it has nothing to do with class. And remember, that's what Gramsci and a lot of these cultural Marxists, when I was 18 at UC Santa Cruz, I can remember Herbert Marcuse coming in as a guest to our Greek class with Norman O'Brien. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, the class struggle didn't work in the 60s because these Americans are addicted to consumer capitalism. They can be bought off by trinkets. They'll never have a revolution because it's a mobile economy. It's fluid. People go up and down. But race. And what he was saying became gospel. And what they meant was, once you are declared Black or Hispanic or of mixed race, that's something that is a brand in their eyes upon you. And that can be used as a proof of your victimization and exploitation, no matter how well you do, no matter how much money you make. And so you get this absurdities where you turn on TV and you see these six-figure anchors who say that they're with the poor, or they're fighting white privilege or white supremacy. They have privilege. Or LeBron James, worth $1 billion, lecturing everybody about freedom of speech and how Black people are not denied full voting rights, why he has $1 billion contract with Nike that's doing business with China that employs Uyghurs. So I think that's really an important issue, that class can transcend race. And if Republicans are wise, they can really develop that constituency, and it would be good for the country.
I think that interview with Oprah and Prince Harry was the first time I kind of said to myself, the Trump era has at least paused, because I've never seen the country get so agitated and provoked into controversy by another issue besides Trump in years. So it was kind of a bookend.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Let me ask you, in 1993, Irving Kristol, the neoconservative writer, he said conservatism was really the three pillars. It was religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And as I was reflecting on that this week prior to our conversation, it seems to me that you now need to add a fourth, which is populism. And those are the four elements of American conservatism today. I'm wondering your thoughts on that. And also, since populism is often so ill-defined, when people describe Trump as a populist or the Republican Party as moving in a populist direction, what do you hear? What does that mean to you?
I think populism is very important. And I grew up in a democratic, my parents, who were both the children of farmers, we lived on the farm, even though they had jobs in town. Whether we got a fair price for raisins or plums was what everybody worried about. We were always told, wait till the harvest is over and we'll see if we can get another car for the family or something. So there was always, so I grew up with the railroads had screwed over my grandparents and tried to steal the farm when they reneged on the $4. It was something like right out of the Octopus. And then when I grew up, my dad called Safeway the Quick S, because you go in there and pay $1, 50 cents a pound for plums. We were getting 3 cents. So that's what, and I think all my siblings except one voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries. One voted for in 2016 for Clinton. So I can, what that argument was is cultural and economic. There were people who were oblivious at how well they were off, and they were oblivious to how they sounded, looked, acted in front of people who didn't have that access. So my parents kind of overdid it. They put us, all the farmers went into sort of private schools or rural schools. We went right into the inner city schools of our small town. We grew up, and my father would always say, you know, you're going to have to learn to fight. You're going to have to learn to get along with people, but never act like you're better than anybody. That was sort of the Democratic pop. So that's destroyed now. The Democratic Party is a party of rich, privileged people. And the people who are small business owners, they interact much better with minorities and poor people than the Silicon Valley or the Wall Street people or the professional entertainment people. So the Republicans have a great opportunity here too, if they embrace populism, not just the issues of populism, you know, good wages and good jobs, and we can do it better here in the United States than they can do it over, let's say, Vietnam, but also the attitude. So when Trump tried to do that, and people didn't quite understand because of the anomaly of his kind of entitled children with all their glitzy lifestyles. And here he was saying, I'd rather be with you tonight right here than with the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And he really did that and that really resonated. For the first time, people said, this guy likes our culture. He trusts our judgment. And so I don't think we're ever going to go back, fairly or not, to a Republican who identifies in a way that Mitt Romney does. I just don't think it's possible. It's not going to work. People will not vote for him. It doesn't have a connection with
patrician
people.
Yeah.
And that why would you want to when the Democrats and the left has ceded to you that constituency by their own arrogance? So if you go on to MSNBC or CNN or the network news or NPR, it just exudes contempt for especially working white people, or, you know, middle-class conservative Hispanics. Anybody whose religion is religious, anybody who's against abortion, anybody who doesn't really believe that, you know, in globalism. So there's a huge opportunity. I just can't see why we would ever go back to someone who would not be able to even envision capturing that voter.
That's right. In 2016, Trump actually beat Hillary on the question of feels for people like you, right? And it's very rare for a Republican to do that. And of course, the great example of this is George H.W. Bush in 1992, where he couldn't really empathize with the people suffering from the economic downturn.
Yeah, you could really see it during the Access Hollywood. That was the nadir of the Trump campaign, when we had that 10-year-old tape that was stealthy, and everybody I know thought he was done for. A lot of conservative people called for him to step down. And I talked to Rush Limbaugh that day and a couple other people, and, you know, they were adamant that he shouldn't, but I was just saying, what would the average person I know say? They'd say stuff like, people screw up. It was 10 years ago. He didn't know he was on record. He was just bragging, whether it's true or not. He was boastful. Every guy does that. And then when Trump said locker room talk, everybody was shocked. That's dismissing how horrible it was. And it probably was horrible. But the point isn't, we're just talking about whether it resonated with a working class voter. So I said to myself, what would he do to counteract that in the debate? What can he say? And of course, he brought all of Bill Clinton's former victims and paraded them there and said to America, the elite do this all the time, but you people in the media contextualize it, and doesn't really bother. So you have no grounds to be ardent feminist in my case. And it worked. And I think that was a lesson that the elite, and we're seeing that with Andrew Cuomo, they have all these rules. And they're mostly race, class, gender, woken rules, and they're not humanistic. So man can be responsible for 15,000 deaths, and among them not just elderly but special needs people, and nobody on the left says a word, gives them an Emmy Award. And yet, when women come forward and said that he was boorish and touched them, then it's suddenly a felony. It should be a felony, but the other should be a death sentence because it was in some ways a form of murder.
You know, it helps to run as a populist candidate when you're going up against Jeb Bush in a primary and then Hillary Clinton in the general. So that's we should be so lucky, I hope, in the coming years with the candidates the Democrats throw up.
I don't think we can count on that.
I know, me neither. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this question of who comes next? Who's on your radar? You wrote a very interesting column, I thought, about this in the past week, about this question of Trumpism without Trump, and whether it's even possible. And when you look out at the landscape today, you see a variety of they're not really mini Trumps, but they're young Republican presidential aspirants who are kind of grasping at some of the issues, some of the attitudes, some of the Trumpian attributes, the swagger, the bumptiousness. Is anyone having success, or in your view, or is there still just Trump? He's still out there. I get a release from him in my inbox every day. He's commenting on the news. How do you look at that landscape?
Well, Trump was given a great gift when he was banned from Twitter and Facebook, because he was not able to comment on the minutia that sometimes didn't work for him. So that's really helped him. We've known more about the Capitol. So the officer who tragically died was not murdered by a Trump supporter. Of the 5 dead, you saw these headlines, 5 killed. Of the 5, I don't think, Brian, we're going to hear Sicknick was probably died of either an allergic reaction to something in the air, or maybe he would have sprayed, but he was not hit and died of head trauma. And the New York Times has already retracted that. The other 4, only 1 died. She was an unarmed female. Usually when an unarmed female, even if they're breaking and entering, is shot, we have the officer's identity immediately, as we did in the George Floyd. We don't know anything about it. We don't know anything about this. And then the other 3 from natural causes, maybe 1 induced by some crowd pressures or tramp. But what I'm getting at is that thing is fading, and whatever one feels. I thought it was a horrendous riot by a bunch of buffoonish people that should be prosecuted. But once that was followed by the militarization of Washington in a way that our distinguished retired generals had warned on June 6th and 7th in the summer. We don't dare ever call out of 1 federal trooper. That would be authoritarian. And then the whole country looks like Jubal Early's on the outskirts ready to attack in the Civil War, and nobody says a word from the military. So all of that in a synergistic way has helped Trump. And people have even forgot the disaster in Georgia. And so it's very dangerous. Every time you write him off about impeachment, people don't understand that he doesn't react like a normal. He doesn't play Hamlet. He doesn't say to be or not to be. It's always to be with him. And anything that doesn't kill him makes him stronger. And so people underestimate him. I don't know what that translates into. My advice to him would be that after the election was lost, and the first week he was not successful with the legitimate complaints about the changing arbitrarily so by bureaucrats and judges of the state legislatures voting laws. When that was not successful, I think they should have been in some cases, but when that was out, there was no practical way he was going to win that election. But by persisting and challenging on December 11th the choice of the electors, then he started to become a Hillary-like in the mind of the swing voter in 2016, where she never really conceded. And then we lost the Georgia. There was all that anger, and then it led. So that, I think, had he just gone down to Georgia and said, I was robbed, but I'm not going to talk about it. We're going to win. Purdue's going to win. Loeffler's going to win. I'm going to barnstorm the country for him. We're going to win in 2022. And I'm going to be Andy Jackson leading, Pitchfork Brigade back. Righteous, and I think you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. He would be, but that didn't happen. And whether that'll wear off, I don't know. It seems like DeSantis, because he's actually run something, a state, and he has that impeccable educational credentials, but he's also a populist, and he does make decisions tough and controversial like Trump, and he doesn't seem to be as worried about the media reaction. So I think he's definitely the nominal leader. I think polls reflect that. Kristi Noem is sort of Sarah Palin, but actually is running more effectively a state than maybe she did. And she's got that same appeal, charismatic. There's a lot of people who are trying to bridge the gap between traditional Republicanism and Trumpism. And people like Tom Cotton, I think, are really good at that. Mike Pompeo he's very good. I think his effort, he's trying to make foreign policy into a populist issue and saying, you know what, I was Secretary of State, but I took your concerns and I translated them on a global stage with success. I'm not sure about two really effective politicians that I have admirations for their political skills. That's Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley, just because when you talk to Trump supporters, they always bring up the issue of inauthenticity. They're not sure that they're just, that can be addressed, adjudicated at some time. So there's a lot of people out there, but the problem, Matt, is that at some point, and we saw that happen with Nikki Haley, you've got to go to the kingmaker and you've got to cut a deal. Right. Because if you get Donald Trump angry at you, it's not like getting Mitt Romney angry at you or John McCain. You're going to get somebody who's sort of like a pit bull, is not going to let go. And Nikki Haley discovered that. And then you become obsequious and it hurts your brand even more when you have to beg forgiveness or contextualize it. So he's got that role. And yet the paradox is, if you tell Trump, you being Trump, you did all these wonderful things, but you're only going to get 46% of the electorate. And it's because they're going to change the voting laws. And they already did by fiat. It's even going to further hurt you. So you've got to show us how you're going to get that missing 3 to 5% of the electorate to win the Electoral College. And it's either got to have to come from minorities and your new class versus race emphasis, or you've got to reach out to the suburbanite and hang up your Twitter gloves for a while, something like that. So there's a dilemma on both sides.
Yeah. It seems like in so many of these conversations I've been having, and I know you've been having too, when people talk about the future of conservatism or the future of Trumpism, the future is Trump. you can't always just keep getting back to Trump and the way that he changed the Republican Party and conservative movement, and also his continued influence in it. I read recently that Noam was down there in Mar-a-Lago, and she held a fundraiser, and Trump's came by and said a few words. And this, of course, was kind of the imprimatur of well, she has a seal of approval, so she might have a bright future.
I think so. And that attraction with Trump is, let's just take the Middle East, for example. So if a traditional conservative is in power, and people who see a possibility of a new Middle East, especially with a growing Arab-Israeli alliance, come to the president, a conservative Republican. They say, you know, this is a joke that the embassy is not in Jerusalem. The Senate has voted for it year after year, people, but they don't do it. This is a joke that the Golan Heights, with that strategic position, which you use as a launching pad against Israel, is ever going to go back to that corrupt Assad dynasty. This is a joke that we'd ever get back into this. We should stay in this Iran deal. Just a total joke, because it was just a pathway to get a bomb in 10 years and destroy Israel. And I could go on, but our $700 million for the Palestinians, if you can't have a peace deal without the Palestinians with veto power over it. Most Republicans, good Republicans, would have said, these are very complex issues. I don't want to have a third intifada. We'll have a committee, we'll explore it. I'll get both sides. And Trump just said, I basically am a conservative president. So if you're a conservative president, yeah, that's good. Bang, 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 bang. And he said, I sort of like, you know, Grant in the summer of 1864, when they went to Grant and they said, General Grant, Lee is doing this and Lee is doing this and Lee's doing this. And what are we going to do? And we can't take Richmond. And Grant said, I don't want to hear about somersaults. I don't want to hear what Lee's going to do. I want to hear what you're going to do to Lee. And that's Trump's attitude. He says, I don't want to hear what all these things can happen in the Middle East. I want to know what they're going to have to do when I do this, because now the onus is on them. And I'm going to show that a lot of these truisms were frauds all along. And he did the same thing with the NATO thing. So that was his secret, I think, to all of his power and influence, that when somebody came to him and outlined, this is a conservative position ideally, but these were the practical ramifications of ever exercising that decision-making, he just said, those aren't ramifications, because he had an innate sense that when it was all over, people would admire that he got things done and he was decisive, and it was a good thing to do. And I think he was right about that. So I think what people are looking for is that decisiveness. And Reagan had that, you know, No other, when he said tear down that wall, everybody in the State Department was aghast that he would ever say that. But he had the right instinct.
And firing the air traffic controllers.
Yes, that was a great.
In 1981, I was thinking about along these same lines when the FDA was thinking of approving the J&J vaccine. And I would say to my wife, if Trump were still president, that vaccine would have been approved back in February, because Trump would have been spending every day banging on the doors of the FDA saying, we know it works, it's working in England, get it approved, get it approved.
Absolutely.
But of course, at that same time, we'd be having, this furious media debate over just Trump trusting the science and everything.
I just went back and looked as an exercise at what people said about Trump in March, April, May about the vaccines. When he said he was going to have 100 million doses of the Pfizer, 100 million of the Moderna, and then he was going to fund the Novavax or the Johnson & Johnson, and then even import the Astra. And the headlines were amazing. Impossible to have a vaccine within a year. Trump diluting American effort. Trump turning over the reins of government to private enterprise. And everything he said happened. And then Joe Biden said that when he became president, there wasn't a single vaccination being given, even though on December 21st, he was smiling as he was vaccinated.
We just have a little time left, Victor. I guess I want to ask you, it seems to me that the right is often at odds with itself. There are all various different intellectual factions and squabbles. And at the end of the day, what really coalesces the American conservative movement is the left, is kind of the insatiable demand for bigger government, more control, more subsidies, and more entitlements. That the left kind of propagates. And so, as you said earlier in this conversation, the left is different today, or at least seems to be, than the left of 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. What should conservatives and even Jewish conservatives, since this is the Jewish Leadership Conference, what should they be looking out for in the next couple of years from the left?
That's a very good question. And there's a thin veneer over the new Democratic Party. This is not, as we said, this isn't even the Democratic Party that the neoconservatives walked out on. This is much more radical. They walked out on the Democratic Party because on bread and butter issues of like safety in the streets or realistic foreign policy, the Democratic Party could not deliver because of certain constituencies. Those constituencies now are not in the minority, they're in the majority. And Joe Biden is the last generation, the last thin veneer over that. When he's gone, they have the energy, they have the power. They may not have the numbers, but it won't matter. I don't want to be derogatory, but the Bolsheviks didn't need a majority either. They were better organized, and neither did the Jacobins. And these are who these people are. They're Jacobins. How it relates to supporters of Israel is, I think, when I work on a campus and I read what professors say, and I can tell you that the elite academic left is anti-Semitic. They may be anti-Israel, but they're anti-Semitic, and they have envy. They have all of the ingredients of anti-Semitism. They feel that a certain group who they think is white is untouchable because of the Holocaust or their Jewishness, and they don't like that. They don't like the idea that any so-called white person could be not free to any open criticism. They're envious of success. They're envious. They have the same in a less severe form of Asian Americans. They call them the perfect minority, or they're against, they want quotas in the same way of Asians that that people did with Jews in the 1940s. It's remarked upon quite frequently. So there's an anti-Semitism, and it's a much more dangerous anti-Semitism than when I grew up. I didn't meet anybody who was Jewish till I was 18, and I went to UC Santa Cruz. I never met somebody who was Jewish, but my parents had gone to university at Stanford and University Pacific. And so we were just told they were wonderful people. So when I met them, they were, but I had grown up in the ag group where people said all the Jews control the markets. And it was a right-wing anti-Semitism. And you'd go talk to a neighbor and he'd say, well, we got they say we're going to get $5 a box for our Goldcrest peaches, but them Jews in New York they'll just take all the money. That was the anti-Semitism. I don't hear that anymore. It's all from the left. And what makes it more dangerous is it's much more subtle, much more educated, much more right, much more acceptable. And when the left does it, that means the media has bought into it as well. When the right does it, it's open, it's crude, it's buffoonish, and there's a media there to say but there's nobody policing the police. And that makes it much more dangerous. And then I think the second issue is, as Israel becomes more and more powerful, and it's showing that scientifically, technologically, economically, militarily, it's coming into what everybody thought would happen earlier. But it's now appealing economically to the Arab nations. It's got moderate Arab support. Even the Europeans are coming around in some degree. And the Iranians are going to get desperate. And I do think at some point we're going to have a collision with Iran. It's in shambles. It's got minority problems. The oil price, it's going back up, but it didn't handle COVID. Its Chinese patron is pretty demanding of it. And there's going to be a confrontation. And the left is going to be on the side of Iran. I think the worst thing I'd ever seen in my life, if I look at foreign policy, was this crackpot, surreal effort to take a bellicose, anti-Semitic, deadly country like Iran and turn it into a victimized, we're Persian Shia, and we didn't get our proper historical role in the Middle East, and the Obama administration is going to even out the field. And maybe if Israel doesn't like it, they're going to have to deal with an empowered Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas, Assad. Oh, we didn't really know that we empowered them, but they did that intentionally, to send a message to the Likud, or what they call the Likud, or Netanyahu, to say, look, if you don't, we might let our little bulldog off its leash, and then you deal with it. I thought that was a very sinister, evil thing to do. So I think they're capable of doing that again. So I would be very, very wary of the new left. I was attacked along with Neil Ferguson and Scott Atlas recently by a group of leftist professors at Stanford. And Scott's crime was he worked for Trump, and he suggested the Florida model was basically more successful than the California. Neil goes way back, where he wrote a private email to somebody in a joke, and they said and mine was that I didn't early enough call for Trump to cease question. I think I did a week. They said, therefore I'm responsible for 5 capital debt. But what I'm getting at is, one of the professors, it took me 30 seconds. So when this person was in the faculty senate, first thing I discovered, that he had a website and he had recommended reading. And the first thing was If America Knew. And I looked at this thing, and it was just this virulently anti-Semitic thing. I could not believe it. It was full of hate. It was full of stereotype racism. And this guy was the voice of the humanitarian left. And nobody had said a word. Nobody said a word. We mentioned it. We put it in print. But that's what I'm getting at, that anti-Semitism is an acceptable hatred among the left, because for a variety of reasons. And we found out the right couldn't get away with it. And it's pretty much, it's not that there's not white supremacists, they're anti-Semite, but they're completely ignored or hated. Whereas it's acceptable. And part of it, just to finish, I'm being a little windy, is, and I'll be blunt here, is that the elite African-American leadership on the left feels that in a Farrakhan fashion, they cannot say anything about Farrakhan, they can't say anything about Al Sharpton, they can't say anything about that leadership, or Ilhan Omar or Rashid Tlaib, any of those people who, in very subtle ways, but nevertheless, not Farrakhan, of course, but they voice a continued anti-Semitic narrative, and nobody in the Democratic Party will say to them, stop it. They just won't do it. And so it's growing, and it's part of the woke movement, to be frank, and people have to speak out against it.
Well, I think that's a very sobering place to end, but also in a way a hopeful one, if we think of this new Trumpified populist conservatism as also being a conservatism that is supportive of Israel, defends Israel, and also campaigns against anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I know I could keep pinging you with questions for much longer, but until next time, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Matt, and thanks you, the organizers of everything.